If we have to go back to the definition, right? If you would define microservices now, I know that people take microservices into different types of understanding, different types of characteristics, but maybe from you originally, how would you define microservices now?
And we've talked about going back and writing a version 2 or writing an updated, a second edition, if you like. I think it holds up pretty well. I mean, there's always going to be, I think Martin calls it semantic diffusion, right? Where the original meaning of a term is lost over time as many people start to add their own meanings to it. But I think actually, if you look at those characteristics, they stand up pretty well and might make more of a focus actually on the business side of things rather than the technical side of things. I think the technical side of things has accelerated off in all sorts of directions. Remember, Docker came after this, right? And Kubernetes. These are technologies that have been invented or popularized because Docker's, the underlying tech has been around for ages to help, obviously, a lot with building distributed systems. It makes it a lot easier. But I think that when I'm consulting, the things I see least applied are the things around products versus projects and the organization around business capabilities and really embedding domain-driven design into the heart of what you do. And I think that's because that's actually harder in some ways to solve than the technology problems of breaking things up and remote communication. And why do I say that? Well, because it involves humans, right? So whenever we're in a position where we involve humans and teams and people and structures, and this maybe relates to some of the stuff I'll talk about later, but the timescales for change and for experimentation are much longer. It's much harder to change your development organization or your organizational structure frequently, like we can do when we refactor code bases or when we actually redesign or re-architecture, because it takes a long time to see if something's working. I think the other thing is with the characteristics, I probably would have emphasized Conway's Law more in a sense, because I think that, again, is something that's a real driver for a lot of the microservices, a lot of the problems I see with implementations. You often get asked a question like, we've got these 2,000 services. Like, how am I supposed to understand all of those? To which my answer is, well, you're not, right? That's the whole point of breaking things up into smaller units, organizing around the capabilities, around the domains, and then splitting the teams up like that. Conway's Law act in there so that all you need to know is about the things that you know about and the things maybe adjacent to you. You don't need to know about all 2,000 or 4,000 of these things that you've got. I think that's definitely something that I would maybe go back and focus a little bit on. Sam Newman has got a lovely phrase he talks about, when you've got a big problem, how do you solve a really big, complex problem? Break it up into a lot of smaller but still complex problems and solve the small problems. And that's really what we were trying to, that's one of the hearts of microservices. The other thing I probably would have emphasized a bit more, and this is maybe due to my journey as a software professional since, is the concept of flow. So I probably would have put more effort into describing how these optimize your ability to get things done and to scale teams around these things, because that fundamentally is such a huge issue in our industry. How do we go faster? How do we get more stuff done? How do we improve the developer experience? How do we get value out the door, improve cost of delay, all these things? And I think microservices at the heart are a way of doing that, but only if they're done, I'm going to say properly, I'm air quoting properly, by paying attention to how you split up your teams and that you don't get this massive distributed monolith that everyone has to understand everything and everything has to be deployed all at once. But that just might be my obsession with flow and flow efficiency that I've developed over the last few years. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I think what you said is really insightful because many people actually took to the extreme on the technology side, right? So things like, for example, lines of code, like how big is a microservice, right? Or what technologies that we should use, maybe like Kubernetes, container, and things like that. But I think you remind us the important things, which is already defined by both of you in the article itself, 9 characteristics, right? And things that stand true to the test of time, I believe. Things like, for example, componentization via services, organized around business capabilities, products, not projects, and things like that. So I think that's really insightful. And I like the way you also mentioned about Conway's Law. I think Von Vernon also mentioned that it's like a law of gravity. You can't escape from that. And you just need to adapt to Conway's Law, right? The other thing about microservices lately is that people have been swinging, right? So some started with like service-oriented architecture, then they went into microservices. Monolith became quite a trend as well because people implemented microservices in the wrong way. And now people started to think about right-size service, microservice. So what do you think about all these different swings, right? What could go wrong here? Or what is the underlying trend behind all these?
That's a good question. I mean, going back, and I'm fortunate enough to have been involved in the industry for a fair amount of time, you mentioned service-oriented architecture. But what was the driver for SOA to start with, right? So this is pre-API economy. This is, in many ways, this is pre-e-commerce, right? The ideas behind service-oriented architectures, it was about how to maximize the investment in our internal IT estate, right? If you think about how organizations grew in the 80s and 90s, what you had internally, you'd end up with lots of these different platforms that were sometimes doing the same thing, sometimes not. You'd have big ERP systems that were like, sucked all your data in, it was really hard to get stuff out of. Maybe one department bought one thing, another department bought another thing, and they both did the same thing. So you end up with duplication of investments and things. And service-oriented architecture really was this idea of, can we create a set of common building blocks that we can use in our organization, right? So this is going back to capabilities as well. Business capabilities were first talked about in the late 50s. So this is nothing new, right? But when we talked about capabilities, they were talked about not in the sense of purely the software, right? Just the services. They were talked about in the sense of the people, processes, and tools that make up an important part of what your business does. And service-oriented architecture was about then almost like creating these units that will allow these things to talk to one another without the duplication and so on. So reducing cost by doing X, Y, Z. And I think as things change, as then you move into the internet age, into the world of where everything is digital. Doesn't matter if you're bricks and mortar retailer, you're also a digital retailer in a sense. At least you have to offer your catalogs digitally, etc. Then the meaning of a service-oriented architecture started to change. We started to think less about internal integration between systems and how to make that more stable, which is really where my head was back in the day, into this idea of, okay, how do we offer APIs externally? How do we build software that's providing these APIs that either our channels can use or that we can offer as a service, Google Maps as an example? So, there's been this long-term trend towards more service-oriented architecture everywhere, if you like. Back in 2014, 15, in my training courses, I'd be asked, how big should one be? Do you think we'll end up with thousands of these small things that are 50 lines of code each? Which some proponents of them at the time were saying, there was one classically, what was his name? Chad, it'll come to me in a minute. But his rule was, you can write your service in any language you like, as long as you can rewrite it in half a day in another language, which means things are really small, So there was that movement. Then there's also the idea of modular monoliths. Do we have to start with microservices? This seems like a really complex way to build simple systems. And it is a really complex way to build simple systems. I don't think anyone's ever said that you shouldn't build structured monoliths. I think the problem came that over time, we saw it's really hard once you go past a certain scale to keep the monolith modular. If you've got something that's relatively simple and small, then that's fine. But at a certain point, with a certain amount of churn on the team, with a certain number of people working on the platform, etc., you tend to reach a point where things start to become tangled. You end up having to put a lot of energy into managing tech debt, or a lot of energy into avoiding entropy, if you like, in the monolith. So I think naturally we sort of swung one way. I think then naturally we're swinging somewhat in the other direction. But I also think there's something in the middle, right? And I suspect we still haven't settled on that yet, which probably looks a bit more like fine-grained service-oriented architectures, which, as Adrian would say. Because at certain points, at certain scales, you can't solve the problems without using this sort of distributed system. There are certain things you have to use these sort of patterns for. And obviously, as an industry, we are amazing. We're a bit like Uberos, the snake that eats its own tail. We keep on going back round and round and round and doing the same things. There's a funny conversation with someone recently about what should we use Simple Stack to build like an simple internal web app that's never going to be exposed to the outside world. It's going to be a really simple line of business kind of thing. Not many users. And of course, the immediate reaction from many people was, well, first of all, you start with React, and then you need maybe GraphQL, this massive stack of stuff, right? Just to build something that you could do really simply via server-side rendering. And I think that's the same with microservices. We'll hit everything with a microservices hammer, forgetting that you don't always have to solve every problem that way. I still think they're very useful tools, though, although I do often, when I introduce myself as the sort of grumpy uncle of microservices, I do say, and I'm sorry about that,
Right. So I think one of the classic things also for people who are building internal tools, like what you said just now, right? So there are only a few developers, but they create more than the number of services that they could handle as a one person. So for example, one person could handle 3 to 5 microservices on his own. I think that's also probably not the right thing to do.